right, we'll go live here in just a little bit. Good to have everybody with us. Thank you, Bill. Seven o'clock on the dot, according to the big red clock in front of me. So we'll give it just another minute or so, and we'll get going. Tonight is a jam-packed full lesson. I don't know if you happen to read the tagline on tonight's lesson or listen to the video that I put out a few hours ago, but tonight is Anti-Catholicism, anti-kennedyism, anti-communism, Vietnam, racism and social justice, a little bit more of fiery Foy Wallace Jr., and how one single Church of Christ preacher just about did Kennedy's presidential run in 1960 in September in a meeting in Houston. Oh yeah, and Hugh Hefner. Yeah, Hugh Hefner finds his way into tonight's conversation. So we will cover and forage some interesting territory tonight, to be sure. So glad to have you with us. This will be the first of at least two conversations we'll have about the 1960s, probably closer to three conversations, because there's just so much that goes on for us to talk about. But we're going to start, and to quote the great theologian Bob Dylan, the times they are a-changin'. And the 1960s, part one. So for us to set the table for this, I'm going to begin and end by talking about some big 40, 50,000 foot helicopter view perspective here on the movement, the Stone Campbell movement as it has brought us to this place, and sort of where it's going to go by the end of the 1960s, by the end of 1968 specifically. So to start, we remember that Stone and Campbell, they're two movements united in 1832 and stayed a unified movement despite controversy over instrumental music, despite controversy over the Missionary Society, 1849. But over time, as the 20th century approaches, the threads of the cord that are holding this unified movement together begin to fray. And 1906, David Lipscomb tells Mr. S.R.N. North, who asks him, "What do I put? Is this three different movements? Is it one movement? What?" 1906, three movements, okay? The census. So you have churches of Christ, Christian churches, churches of Christ, Christian church disciples of Christ, all independently recognized as different denominations according to the census, all while underneath there is still this we're not a denomination idea going on. That's going to be really important as we progress through the 1960s, because as we're going to see, churches of Christ move from a sect to becoming a denomination. As far as their recognition in the American religious scene and the global religious scene and the political scene and the political machine, we're going to talk about that more, okay? There are other divisions that happen. We are confining our conversations for the most part right now to churches of Christ. 1927, the North American Christian Convention, as it's known now, or the National Council of Churches of Christ, comes out of the Stone Campbell movement, but it recognizes a division in 1927, and in 1968, the disciples split again. And so we have all of these fractures taking place in the big picture of the movement. Now, as these things happen, there are things taking place within this movement that we are going to talk about more and more over the course of tonight and the next few weeks. First of all, churches of Christ are making a move from being a rural and agrarian group of people to a middle class group of people. This is essentially in the wake of World War II, the education boom, the building program boom, the Christian college and education boom, all are a big part of that. You also have the move from being sort of this back burner. Even if you read some of the historians and, scholars who write about church history, they say, we sort of moved from a backwoods group to a movement of national prominence. That's going to be important as we talk tonight. From a local unknown, churches of Christ and people within churches of Christ, its elders, its ministers, its members, its deacons, its leaders, become people who lead on the civic scene. We're going to talk about that more. We move from uneducated in the sense of higher education to very educated. And all of these things combine to move churches of Christ from a sect to a denomination. Now, I know that term is loaded with all kinds of baggage depending on who your influences were, or if you spend a lot of time growing up in churches of Christ, who the voices are that you listen to, or who you read, or who you listen to, or who has influence on you. But we're going to unpack that. And I want to try to present that accurately in the broader sense of history, in the broader sense of the American religious scene in the 1960s, the best I can. What is happening? And what has happened to bring us to the 1960s is a ever-growing, dividing movement. You have these voices that are passed down over a generation or two from Daniel Sommer to people like Foye Wallace Jr. and to his protégés, Fanning Yater Tant and Roy Cogdell. In their mind, they are people who are trying to contend and defend what they might call religious conservatism, what they might call even middle ground, although as we're going to see as time progresses on the scale of centrist in the middle and right and left, and those terms meaning nothing more than that, there is an ever-growing division between what is in the middle, the mainstream, if you want to think about it that way, and where these are voices of the anti and non-branches, whether it's anti-institutional, whether it's non-Sunday school, those are these guys. They are everything about the church not becoming an institution, not becoming a denomination. Yet, the things that they are doing are more and more and more and more, making them so sectarian that it is becoming a denomination. And their journals like the Bible Banner and the Gospel Guardian and later things like Contending for the Faith and others are just creating this further divide between everybody that is making up this movement of churches of Christ. You also have the older journals like the Firm Foundation going back to 1884 and the Gospel Advocate going back to 1855. In their mind, at some point, these are becoming more of a centrist or mainline group. Now, it's not going to stay that way forever. As time progresses, we're going to see Gospel Advocate and Firm Foundation become a different direction in the next 20 or 25 years. You also have these new journals that have come on the scene in 1938 and 1939 respectively, 20th Century Christian and Christian Leader. Now, as far as the Foy Wallaces and the Tants and the Cogduls and the anti-institutional groups of the Churches of Christ, these guys are nothing but a bunch of long-haired hippie liberals. They're out there and they're dancing and drinking and chewing and associating with those who doing. We don't dance, drink, or chew and associate with those who do. You know, in the minds of the people in the anti-wing, these people represent everything that's bad. And so what you have is this growing rift between the antis and folks who are trying to move away from the sectarian and Irenic spirit that for them is represented by people like Foy Wallace Jr., who is fight or die in some semblance to what he pushes. And so there's a huge rift going on, and it's growing, and the differences between, if you want to say right and left or center and either side, it's getting broader and deeper and wider between everybody. And this just mirrors a lot of cultural change that's taking place as well. Things are changing, right? Let's talk about some of the changes that we've anticipated a little bit. We've already talked about the emerging media. You've got more journalistic options. It's not just radio and the paper anymore. You've got multiple papers. It's not just either the Gospel Advocate if you were in Tennessee or nearby, or if you were in Texas, the Firm Foundation, just depending on which one was closer, and you were going to count on one to call out the other and share what was good about the other. It's not that way anymore. You have it's like a journal a day keeps the denominations away, is what it seems like. And all these journals are coming onto the scene, and there's more options and more things to read. Radio and TV. This is going to be really, really important. And I know that's no surprise. But as more houses have TVs, and more people have access to all of this media that's growing, right? Wouldn't they just be licking their fingers if they had Facebook and Twitter and Vine and Snapchat and everything else that we have now? If they had it back then, who knows what it would have looked like. But there's more fragmentation, there's more media, and that yields a wider diversity of subject matter being delivered by different means. There is more as this evolving subject matter grows, there is more of a mainstream that is created by people who don't want to be a part of the divisive, argumentative spirit that they saw on one side. Neither do they want to be associated with, liberalism. Because for some people, liberalism meant 3 letters. It meant JFK. And that was bad for a lot of people. And I'm sitting here looking at Jeff Clemens in the room, who's nodding his head like, this sounds familiar. For a lot of people, those 3 letters, JFK, were everything that was bad about liberals. And if you weren't, for them, you were against them. We're going to talk about that. But a more of a middle-of-the-road centrist group is developing as all of these different fragmentations are taking place. Now, something happens as these new mediums come about. The newer bishops, we're gone are the days of David Lipscomb and Daniel Sommer and E.G. Sewell and some of those early bishops, print bishops, even editor bishops, Leroy Garrett calls them, who helped to police each other and present what was happening in some level of an equivocal manner. Even people like B.C. Goodpasture in the 40s and 50s at Gospel Advocate was trying to be more like David Lipscomb than some of the divisive counterparts that they were seeing come into play. But these electronic bishops, speak to a national audience where you have some of these previous print media bishops who, the term that I can think of that might be used is like intermediate bishops or intramural bishops. They sort of only speak within the confines of churches of Christ, and even within that, they only speak to their particular audiences. But national prominence and national media means a broader audience beyond churches of Christ, and that requires some critical thinking and some significant thought that's going into what are we communicating and how are we communicating it. And no man helped make this happen more than Batsell Barrett Baxter, longtime preacher for the Hillsboro Church in Nashville, was associated with the Herald of Truth. He is in the roots of what we talked about last week, the Stone and Lipscomb tradition that was more about acceptance and discussion and opposing views, breeding healthy conversation and returning to Scripture for discussion. He follows on the heels of other names, and we throw out a lot of names in here, guys, I know that, but we throw out names like G.C. Brewer and Norval Young and E.W. McMillan and Jesse P. Sewell, people we talked about last week who were modernizers in the sense of the things that they helped usher in the 40s and 50s to set the table for the 60s. But the other thing, and you see this up here on the screen, but in the late 1950s, in addition to a change in the way things were delivered, there was a change in content. 3 books make a tremendous national influence. From Judaism, you have a book by a man named Joshua Liebman called Peace of Mind that came out in 1946. The Catholic side, there was a book by a man named Thunton Sheen called Peace of Soul. And the one that we're probably most familiar with our audience, is Norman Vincent Peale, The Power of Positive Thinking. Norman Vincent Peale, a prominent writer and preacher in New York City. And on the heels of these books, Batsell Barrett Baxter and others who will follow in his footsteps as electronic bishops wield a great amount of symbolic power that largely goes unnoticed. Nobody sees what's happening in this undercurrent of very subtle change in content and in the way the content is delivered. For the most part, churches of Christ had denied this idea that there was a power beyond the local congregation, right? It's all about congregational autonomy. We are fiercely democratic. This is what Foy Wallace preached. This is what Alexander Campbell preached for so long. And no one's denying that. The difference is no one was prepared to appreciate the power that came with national television programming. You think about somebody who you could be, so he goes down to his local PBS station in Pittsburgh, and the rest is history. Generations are brought up with kindness and love and acceptance, regardless of the color of your skin. Well, guess what? That's the way the message has to be taught. I want to show you 2 clips. The first clip is from a broadcast of the Herald of Truth in 1960. This is a clip of the Union Avenue Church of Christ in Memphis, Tennessee, and you'll see how they broadcast and what that format looks like. And then we're going to watch a clip from 1972 with Batsell Barrett Baxter speaking in that Herald of Truth program. And I just want you to see the big difference, okay? 1960 is first, and then 1972 will follow. And I'm going to unmic myself so you can hear this. You heard of
Herald of Truth, brought to you with the assistance of sister congregations, regular Sunday morning services of the Union Avenue Church of Christ in Memphis, Tennessee. The service is now in progress, but before we join the congregation in worship, we would like to tell you something of the Union Avenue Church. Although the Church of Christ had its beginning 1900 years ago on Pentecost in A.D. 33, this congregation was first organized in 1901 with 9 charter members. It moved to its present location in 1925 and now has a membership of more than 1,100. The present minister of the church is Mr. Alonzo D. Welch, shown here in his study in a typical meditative mood. The Bible is recognized by the 16,000 churches of Christ in the world today as their only rule of faith and practice. The educational program of the Union Avenue Church provides Bible instruction for more than 800 students each Sunday. A large corps of competent, dedicated teachers employ the most modern methods in communicating the right ways of the Lord. It is their purpose through a study of the Bible itself to restore the Christianity of apostolic times, free from the distortion of human tradition. Now let us enter into the sanctuary and join this congregation in the worship of God. The singing is under the direction of Mr. Robert Riggs.
Brother L.M. Graves, an elder of the church, will lead us in prayer.
Now, I only have one thought here before I show you the second clip, and that is for me to put myself in a position that will show you what I look like when I'm in a particularly reflective mood. Just kidding. Okay, now, 1972, here is a clip from the Herald of Truth program featuring Batsell Barrett Baxter. And I want you to think about all the things that are different about these two clips, because they're very, very different from the very first moment. 1972 Herald of Truth broadcast. Same company, same ownership principle, same sponsoring congregation principle as well.
Kabuki, like all ancient drama, Greek, Roman, Chinese, intends to tell its story with impersonation, exaggerated masks that readily identify and separate good from bad, joy from sorrow. The face, the image of the man,
with no shades or degrees of likeness between the two. The difference readily discernible by the audience from the moment they step on stage. Historically, the ancient Greek masks of comedy and tragedy, one smiling, the other grimacing, reflect an imaginary life suspended between tears and laughter, which in the eyes of the dramatist or the role of the actor often are the ultimate reward in the search for happiness. You laugh or cry. It's as simple as that. The mask projects the part as it projects the voice. The skilled hands of a makeup artist can draw the deep lines of age or sorrow into the facial mask of a tragedian. A circus clown can put on a false nose, a few pieces of putty, and make himself comical, but far from being simply a prop in the theater or circus, television, or the motion pictures. The mask has become as much a fixture in modern civilization as it was in primitive society. Masks are worn for protection. Masks are worn for amusement. Halloween and Mardi Gras false faces continue the tradition of mummers who performed pantomimes in masks from house to house at Christmas time back in early England. Most Americans, of course, need no costume. They wear the natural mask of the world in all its shapes, sizes, and colors. Hiding behind synthetic emotions and artificial appearances, they act out roles the world expects of them, while inwardly they're torn between the tragedy and the comedy of modern life, between tears and laughter.
Between Tears and Laughter, another program in the continuing series titled The Search for Happiness. On this, a Herald of Truth, featuring the well-known author, college educator, and minister Batsell Barrett Baxter, chairman of the Department of Bible, David Lipscomb College, Nashville, Tennessee, and minister of the Hillsborough Church of Christ in Nashville.
Throughout the thousands of years that human beings have been on earth, a mask, whether it was for protection, or disguise, or an imaginative flight into fancy, has held a curious universal fascination for men. Now, besides practical protective masks, we often think of the masks these days simply as false faces worn by children at Halloween, or disguises worn by adults at Mardi Gras celebrations or costume balls. Now, the modern housewife might see little relation between a social masquerade party and these primitive masks used for ceremonial rites. But what is the difference? Is it that we consider one civilized and the other primitive? One is good-natured fun, while the other is worn out of ignorance and fear? What about the common, everyday masks of civilized society? Are they really so different after all? Today's masks are certainly more subtle than those of the past. Today's mask is more likely to be a facial expression that disguises our true inner feelings, or an attitude that we assume as a shield against criticism or reality, or the front that we put up to impress others with, keeping up with the Joneses. What men of all ages have in common, and what is symbolized in all ages by an infinite variety of masks, is a gulf between what we are and do, and what we would like to be and do. Oh, there's a little of the actor in all of us, a little of the spirit that life should be unutterably a bore if we could not live in the realm of imagination as well as the life of time and space.
Now, if you are near someone that you can discuss this with, I'm sure that you are already thinking about a host of differences between those two videos, whether it's black and white to color, and granted, color was never meant to be seen like what they had in 1972 on a 65-inch flat screen TV, like we blew it up to show there. And hopefully you could hear that audio. It's 55 years old, and so it's doing even good to be in a digital format. But whether it's the simple move from black and white to color, or the fact that in the first video you were given a commercial about the Church of Christ, or in the second video you were immediately drawn in to the fact that you weren't even looking at the speaker. You were being narrated through images of different theater styles, or just different kinds of conversation. You were lulled into a story and a narrative, as opposed to looking on screen at stilted camera shots of a homogeneous crowd of 1,100 people that pretty much all look alike. There were a lot of differences between those two things, but such is the move that brought Churches of Christ into a national place of prominence through the media, because of people like Batsell Barrett Baxter. They found, and this is something we probably don't think about enough, but the idea of being electronic bishops was probably, even though Batsell Barrett Baxter was one of the great thinkers of our movement and the great communicators, it wasn't like they set out trying to figure out, now how can I be in control of this movement and control the conversation? That wasn't the case at all. The more that speakers like Baxter, and he's certainly the one who led the charge, focused on issues that concerned the larger public rather than on divisive issues that concerned the historic appeal of Churches of Christ, the more they eliminated the need for any kind of referee bishop at all. By the mid-70s, the message of the Herald of Truth had almost become indistinguishable from things that were being presented on a variety of conservative and or conservative evangelical radio and television programs. Now, that's not to cast judgment on Herald of Truth either. They found that by speaking to issues like family and personal spiritual growth, and Bible story, as opposed to, a particular issue that was divisive in a corner of a movement, gained themselves instant credibility with a larger audience. It wasn't long before Chet Huntley and the crew of NBC News was at the Hillsborough congregation to do an entire national news segment on Baxter and what he had accomplished in just a short time with the Herald of Truth. It's pretty incredible. But this is just one little microcosmic action that represents a great decade of transition and a springboard for things that are to come. If you think about some big names through this time, we constantly talk about Baxter and people like Norval Young. Norval Young, who would become, after being the president, the preacher for the Broadway Church in Lubbock, would have become the president at Pepperdine University and a critical voice in their move from a small downtown LA college to a national university in Malibu, from 30 acres to almost 1,000 acres. And just a big move there. But Norval Young is sort of one representative, quintessential builder. And he moves to California in 1957, and one person that he brings along with him is a man named Bill Benoski. Bill Benoski, who was later become the president at Pepperdine, and later the University of Oklahoma. Only one man who served at 2 Tier 1 major universities as president in American history, as I have read. Maybe you know of someone else. But Benoski, who also moved from preaching from the Broadway Church in Lubbock, Texas to Pepperdine, Benoski gained fame as sort of being a giant slayer. And in 1967, he took on a man named Anson Mount. Anson Mount was the religion editor of Playboy magazine. And you see in this picture Benoski in the middle between Anson Mount and Hugh Hefner. If you had told Alexander Campbell and Barton Stone and David Lipscomb that Churches of Christ would find themselves in less than 100 years on the national scene with a prominent leader debating free love and open love and sexuality with the man associated with pornography in the middle of the 20th century, I don't know what their reaction would have been. But this is, in some essence, the journey that Churches of Christ have made. Benoski debates Joseph Fletcher. He debates an Episcopal bishop, Jim Pike, on morality and on situational ethics. And sort of this is, using Pepperdine's transformation from a college campus to one that looks like this. This is an amalgam that symbolizes the transformation of the Church of Christ as a denomination in the 1960s. A group that now included, not just your average Joe working man, but Churches of Christ now includes the congressman, the university president, the county judge, the city mayor, the sheriff, the bank executive, dentists and doctors and business executives. And this is within a group that even at the beginning of the 20th century held as one of its beliefs that we should not be voting. Think about that. David Lipscomb's positions on civil government have not been that long ago. And now here we are on the national scene. The very idea that Churches of Christ could even be connected to such an enterprise would have boggled the minds of people in the 19th century. And it startled people who found themselves now in the middle of this as the 70s approached. The Malibu campus, which is one of the most beautiful campuses in the world, symbolized the way that Churches of Christ now feel at home in the worlds that many of their forebearers had rejected. A man who moved from David Lipscomb College to Middle Tennessee State University in 1966, a man by the name of Norman Parks, is the one who talked about the fact that Churches of Christ went from the average working man to now including any and everybody from the most successful strata of society. Well, what does all this mean? What does this mean in the midst of a turbulent, transitional decade? How have all of a sudden this mainstream movement, how's it going to process all of this? Well, I want to return to four men whose names were associated with that. And I say it's almost a new anti-movement because that's almost what happens. The faithful who had been at the core of Churches of Christ get a rude awakening from a very unlikely source, and that unlikely source is their children. At this point, Churches of Christ had largely adopted the social values of conservative Protestantism in the United States. That is to say, we're Christian, we're not Catholic, and we oppose Catholics. We're overwhelmingly white, and we usually resisted integration. We are male-dominated, resisted any kind of thought of equal opportunity or roles for women. We long abandoned the notions of pacifism that characterized the early pieces of our movement. We're going to stand shoulder to shoulder in support of our military. We're going to stand shoulder to shoulder, shoulder to shoulder. I guess soldier to soldier would work in to support the military venture in Vietnam. But the children of Churches of Christ people in this era have a stark and harsh reality that their parents don't understand, and rejecting the discrepancy between this primitive idea of this Christianity of Stone and Campbell and the reality of what society is saying all around them. And typically the children's reaction was one of two things. One, the idea of primitivism is a joke, and they rejected it altogether and left Churches of Christ entirely, or they turn to this direction of ultra-sectarianism and cast judgment on everybody else who doesn't believe or look like and act like and worship like and believe exactly like they do. And what that does is set the table for an anti-communist, anti-Catholic movement that is facing, for the first time, the election of a potentially Catholic president. If you think about it, just by definition, the story of the evolving group known as Churches of Christ has now, over the course of almost 2 centuries, been this evolution from a sect to a denomination. So Richard Hughes, in his book Reviving the Ancient Faith, says, just by the definition then, Churches of Christ were for the most part clearly a sect throughout their 19th century existence. By the time the 60s arrive, for the most part, Churches of Christ still resist recognition of other denominations as Christians, and they maintain a status as being sectarian. They're overwhelmingly in support of the cultural values that are present in the American South. They identify with the values of white culture as opposed to the values of people of color, with patriarchalism as opposed to gender equality, with middle-aged adults as opposed to youth counterculture, with Protestantism as opposed to Catholicism, with the American military as opposed to the peace movement, and with the policies of politics, of conservatism and law and order. This is the landscape that Churches of Christ find themselves in coming out of World War I. Well, we've talked about these men before: Benson, Goodpasture, Brewer, and now Baxter. There is a strong anti-communist sentiment in the colleges, which aligns the colleges with a number of American industry and business leaders, which also contributes to the rise of this group into national prominence. And here you have G.C. Brewer, the influential preacher who stood out against Foy Wallace Jr. in his ironic spirit and rhetoric. But they were determined, Benson and Brewer and others, to expose Catholicism and communism, which for a lot of these people were hand in hand. And so the journal, The Voice of Freedom, is founded in 1953 and takes tremendous influence, these men, to embrace this anti-communist, anti-Catholic sentiment that sets up the 1960 election. And so mainstream Churches of Christ approach the 60s as we're going to be religious defenders of all that is good about American civilization, and all that is good is all that is Christian, and all that is Protestant, and even to a greater degree, all that is about the Churches of Christ, and especially the white Anglo-Protestant civilization that dominated the American South. This is the present challenge of the 1960s, and the preoccupation with these things might shed a little light on just how unprepared Churches of Christ and so many others were for the social justice issues that are coming. Racism and social justice. Well, in virtually every corner of the Churches of Christ, there was opposition to the election of John F. Kennedy. And you read about this and you see how there is, from the Gospel Guardian and the Christian Chronicle to the Firm Foundation to the Christian Leader, there is almost unanimous opposition to the election of a Catholic president because they imagine that doing that would make America subservient to Rome, that the United States would end up being governed by the Pope, and so there's a massive crusade in all their publications to warn their own members and Americans at large of the grave danger to the United States that would be posed by a Kennedy presidency. And Churches of Christ quietly work in conjunction with a number of Protestant bodies and anti-Catholic groups to come up with these strategies to defeat Kennedy and elect Richard Nixon. Well, it's interesting. People like B.C. Goodpasture and Reuel Lemons write in their documents ways that they are going to oppose him, and the Voice of Freedom, that journal, was going to be a critical piece in this. Churches of Christ gained national publicity for their views on this. I already mentioned Chet Huntley and the NBC crew taping Batzel Barrett Baxter doing a sermon on the Chet Huntley Views TV show on the threat of Catholicism to American liberties, and how even in that very sermon there was a congressional representative who rose up at the end of Mr. Baxter's sermon before he offers the invitation and said, "I came here to worship, not be lectured on politics." Right there on national television. Kind of got swept under the rug. He was an outspoken voice for tolerance among religious persuasions. And then there was another incident. September of 1960, that again brings Churches of Christ to the national scene in a major, major way. John F. Kennedy is in Houston to meet with the Greater Houston Ministerial Association. Several hundred ministers convened, and he would speak for 20 minutes and have a period of open Q&A that would be curated by the head of the Ministerial Association. V.E. Howard, who is a man associated with Churches of Christ, some of you may recognize that name. There's V.E. Howard. You may even recognize him for this, and I'm throwing this in there for you, Randy Cooper.
Hear me, my friends. Are you listening?
He opened 60 years worth of broadcasts with that question. But V.E. Howard, who's not even from Houston, finds a way to get the microphone and ask Senator Kennedy a question wherein he reads a long, just to make sure, a long piece of literature from what he says are Catholic sources to try and corner Kennedy to trip up on his own words. This is awfully resemblant of a Pharisee asking Jesus, "Who is my brother?" Just saying. Sorry, I got to throw that in there because I watched this broadcast, 45 minutes worth of it this afternoon. And anyway, here is V.E. Howard, and he expresses all that gives a black eye not only to Jesus, but to buildings and people who call themselves Church of Christ. And this night, this meeting, V.E. Howard, who was booed in the room and cheered by others as leading the night that stoked the rise of the Christian right that almost derailed his election. If you remember, The Nixon-Kennedy election was the closest election at that point in history. But there's such a chasm growing now between those who resent this divisive spirit amongst churches of Christ. This sentiment of anti-communism, anti-Catholicism, anti-Kennedyism, the pro-Vietnam sentiment, the themes of established authority and law and order were very important in quote-unquote mainline churches of Christ. And often those being prominent led to the obscuring of questions of justice, economic imperialism, environmental destruction, things that were being brought about by the anti-war movement that they were trying to raise. There was even an incident at the 1968 Democratic Convention that brought again churches of Christ to national notoriety for their pulpits being places where they praised the brutality of the Chicago police in keeping the anti-war movement at bay. No editor of any major journal or minor journal acknowledged that any dimension of the movement against the war might have come from a place of moral concern or patriotic concern. Instead, what you saw was a consistent description of the anti-war movement as being pro-communist or communist-inspired. Rule Lemons in the Firm Foundation said, that anti-war stuff is nothing but modern Marxism. B.C. Goodpasture chose to use his pen to quote J. Edgar Hoover in a Church of Christ journal. How far have we come? Well, when all was said and done, over the course of the 60s, Churches of Christ underwent a far-reaching cultural transformation that by the 60s had aligned them with the most conservative forces in American politics. It was a transformation that moved them over some 40 years from the status of a backwater Southern sect, resisting the values of the culture they lived for the sake of being devoted to the kingdom of God, to the status of being a Protestant denomination defending the values of evangelical Protestant America. This transformation was apparent in their anti-Catholicism, which resulted in their almost unanimous rejection of JFK's presidential hopes. Their concern was to save America from the inroads of international communism, strong support for American involvement in the war. And all of this sets the table for the struggle over racism and social justice. Now, that is a lot to take in about 51 minutes of time. A lot happened. The churches of Christ that we experience today in broad scopes, and it's impossible to make generalizations that will make everybody happy, and I know some people will probably watch this and not be happy, and the fact that I'm seeing this and we're having one of our larger audiences watching tonight tells you just how relevant this subject is. But the fragmentation that exists in our churches is largely still existent because of these things that happened in the 1960s. The segregation of black and white churches. We're going to look next week at how when David Lipscomb learned of a church in McKinney, Texas in the early 1900s that refused membership to an African American young lady, he was incensed and demanded that that entire church consider its salvation because it was akin to a loss of salvation to deem judgment on someone for the color of their skin. But we can't understand the struggle of race. Number one, I can't understand it because of the color of my skin. I'll never understand it fully. And so I must do everything I can to try to understand it. But we can't also fully understand the struggle for social justice, the racial struggle that happens in the 1960s, without knowing some of the political landscape that changes as churches of Christ rise to a place of national prominence. So that's the stage. The stage is set. Next week we'll talk more about that. I hope you'll come back and be with us next Wednesday night right here or on YouTube at 7 o'clock. We'd love to have you join us Sunday morning at 10 o'clock right here as well. We'll continue our series, Church Next. Read your emails from today and yesterday. Lots of important information. Watch from the bulletin on Friday. Some very important information about giving that our church members would like for you to be sure and read. But until next week, we'll come back at the same bat time, the same bat channel, and we'll sign off until then. God bless you. Have a great rest of your week.